Democracy comes from the Greek words of demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power or rule. So, democracy basically means the rule of the people. Democracy first started as a direct democracy in Greek cities, notably ancient Athens, where people came together to speak about their concerns and opinions in front of rulers of the city-state, and directly voted on new rules and laws. Here is considered as the birthplace of democracy. For the very first time, decisions were made by the people instead of rulers. But sadly, the ancient Greeks did not see all people equally. Slaves, women, children, and the people who did not have a land weren't allowed to vote. This is what we call a flawed democracy today. After the Greeks lost their power and influence in the 1st century AD, their early forms of democracy were also fading away until the Magna Carta was signed in 1215, which prevented the King of England to do whatever he wanted and said that even the king had to follow the country's rules and laws which were written in the Constitution. Today, most democracies are indirect or representative, which means that you can't vote for a new law yourself, but you can vote for people who then become lawmakers and present your interests. But democracy isn't just about voting. It's about everything to protect the best interests of the people, no matter what is their race, gender, political opinion, or religion. These interests can be human rights, quality of life, infrastructure, and many more.
So this question of how much we can trust the news comes down largely to issues of bias, because it's pretty rare that news organizations lie outright. Without the public trust, readers and viewers will just go somewhere else. This doesn't mean that newspapers, and to a much lesser extent television companies, are without bias, though. The New York Times and Washington Post do tend to be more liberal than conservative, but overall they're probably balanced out by the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and Talk Radio, which tend to be conservative. Putting political bias aside, the most persistent bias in the news seems to be towards conflict and scandal, and these are not really liberal or conservative issues. If anything, the news media is most biased towards conflict, which may explain why you don't see a lot of stories about compromise. 2 politicians smiled and shook hands today, and then walked away, happy. Doesn't sound interesting. Let's look at the 3 main factors that affect news coverage in the thought bubble. The first factor influencing the news is the journalists who make it. Journalists are even more important than their bosses, the publishers, because they have the discretion to report and interpret the news. If you think the news is just the facts, then it's useful to remember that the New York Times slogan used to be, "All the news that's fit to print." Do reporters have a bias towards one political ideology or another? Probably. More journalists identify as liberal and as Democrats than say they are conservative or Republican. The next factor to consider is the source of political news, the politicians themselves. Politicians do a lot of things to create a positive media image for themselves, and this goes beyond shaking hands and kissing babies. They show up at important events, like opening day of the baseball season, or natural disasters, and make the most of these photo opportunities. They also cultivate relationships with reporters, because if a journalist likes you, they might be more likely to write something nice about you, or at least something less mean. One of the best ways to cultivate a good relationship with a journalist is by leaking information to them. A leak is a disclosure of confidential information to a journalist, and politicians can use them to cement relationships with news organizations and to make sure that a story is reported the way that they want it reported. Reporters have a hard time refusing a scoop, so if a politician gives insider information, they can usually influence the way the reporter will tell the story. Thanks.